Welcome to Abundance. You guessed it, a podcast dedicated to all things surrounding dance. I am Kristen.
And I am Hannah, and we are two best friends who are brought together by this art form.
Please join us in 5, 6, 7, 8. Hi everyone, we are here today with two special guests, Jennifer McNamara and Matthew Christensen, whom Hannah and I both had as professors our senior year at Mercyhurst. So we're really excited to have them here and to hear a little bit more about their backgrounds and careers, as well as more specifically Swan Lake, which they recently set at Mercyhurst. So welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
And would you just, to get us kind of rolling this morning, give us a little background for our audience just about you both and your careers?
Okay, I'll start. This is Jennifer. I am from upstate New York. I trained at my home studio forever and ever. I ended up getting my first job right out of high school with the Richmond Ballet. I danced there for a couple of years. I moved out to the West Coast and danced there for 11 or so with a small break in the middle to wait tables and be a nanny for a while I regrouped. When I came back to the company I was with, Matthew joined the company and we got along really well and ended up getting married. And then we moved to Nashville. We danced in Nashville for a few years. And then when we retired, sorry, that's our dog. We retired, we went into teaching. I eventually went back to grad school and got my MFA at Hollins University. And then shortly after that, we moved up to Erie and joined the faculty at Mercyhurst. So in a nutshell, that's me.
Wonderful.
And I started late. I started when I was 17. I started with Gary Horton, who was a student as well as a dancer with Ballet West. And he was a student of Mr. C, or Willem Christensen, as you might know. I got the opportunity to actually study with Willem Christensen when I was dancing at the University of Utah, is where I received most of my formal training. Got a job with Indianapolis Ballet Theater, which I don't know if it exists anymore. But that was my first job. And then I, of course, met Jennifer at Eugene Ballet, Ballet Idaho. And then, of course, we went to Nashville Ballet and we retired. And I've just been teaching throughout. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, so as we continue, we want to hear a bit about Swan Lake. Would you just give our listeners a little bit of a synopsis if they don't know much about Swan Lake, let's just say. And yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about that and your experiences with setting it on Mercyhurst.
So Swan Lake, for those who don't know the story classically or traditionally, it's a story of a princess who has been put under a spell by a sorcerer. The princess is Odette and von Rothbard is the sorcerer. There's not a lot of backstory about why that happens. Usually that's not part of the story of Swan Lake, but if you go into like German folk tales or whatever, there's a lot of source material for it. But anyway, she's under the spell by the sorcerer, along with a group of other maidens, and they are condemned to be swans by day and human by night. And they live by this lake. There is a prince in the same sort of realm of the world, and he is celebrating his birthday and he's coming of age, and his mother, the queen, says that he has to get married, and he is very unhappy about that. So he takes his crossbow and he goes hunting with his friends, and he comes upon the lake where these swan/maidens are living, and it happens to be dusk. And as he's about to shoot one of the swans, she transforms back to her human form, and they have a conversation and they fall in love, and she tells him the story that she's condemned to be a swan, etc. And the only way she can be freed from that spell is to fall in love and to have the object, the man, swear his love to her forever. And he swears his love to her forever by the lakeside. No one's around, so they think. Sometimes von Rothbart sees that, and there's a bit of like jealousy that goes on. Flash forwards to the next night, and the queen, the prince's mother, has arranged for a ball so he can choose a bride, and she brings all of these princesses from other realms for him to choose from, and he is not interested in any of them. And suddenly Rothbart appears unannounced and uninvited and brings with him Odile, who is in some versions, his daughter, that he has disguised to look like Odette. And the prince is smitten, of course, and in front of everybody, he swears his love to Odile, and therefore he has betrayed the trust of Odette. Odette is usually shown in the window watching this happen, so you get this sense of like betrayal and sorrow, and all of the feelings that come with that. And the prince realizes his mistake when he sees Odette out the window, and he is distraught, and Rothbart says it's a done deal. And flash forwards, the prince runs out of the castle and to the lake, and he finds Odette, and she is very sad, of course, because she's been betrayed. And then there's all of the endings, depending on whose version you're doing. Sometimes Siegfried and Rothbart fight, and Siegfried ends up killing Rothbart, and that breaks the spell. Sometimes Odette throws herself into the lake to die because she can't be with Siegfried. And sometimes Siegfried follows her, and they both die and live happily ever after in eternity dead. And sometimes, what other versions are there? I think those are the main ones. There's a lot of dying. Yeah, there's a lot of dying and unhappiness, but happiness in the afterlife. So that's the basics of Swan Lake.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And just out of curiosity, what version did you do at Mercyhurst? What ending?
I was going to ask that too.
So
ultimately we, for how many times I've done Siegfried and having to rationalize the character of this man, and making it more human and relatable to myself. We viewed it as there's some issues that we had and that we wanted to kind of confront with our rendition of Swan Lake. So, and as well as, Odette and Odile that you've done, that Jennifer's done, it's really, we come at it from a humanistic side, like trying to make sure that when we portray, we're making sense to ourselves. So there were some multiple changes that we did, and you can talk about some of them.
So, some of the changes we made are really practical. We're a small university. We don't have a large population of dancers to choose from, but we do have a lot of dancers who are very capable of doing things. Odette and Odile are usually danced by the same person. And in order to be more equitable, we split that into two different women. And rather than having one woman do the whole performance, but only getting fewer performances, we decided it was better to give one person Odile for the run of the shows and one person Odette for the run of the shows. So that was our way of making things equitable, but also giving people a chance to dig in and like get past the surface of the role, which if you only have like one or two shows, sometimes you don't get that chance to like settle into what you're doing. We also were in a year where we didn't have a lot of men in the department. Some years there are a lot of men, some years there are not. So we didn't have very many. So that brought up some gender questions in our casting. And also we had some questions about why certain roles are cast to certain genders when we see that the human body can do lots of things, and there's no such thing as a feminine movement or a masculine movement. It is just human movement. So we did purposefully play with some of those ideas of gender in the way we cast things. Mostly from our perspective, it was to start a conversation about the body that is doing the dancing, not necessarily the costume that the body is wearing or any of those those ideas. And it does bring up like ideas of like, well, if a woman is doing this part, she should act a certain way. But that then brings up the conversation that's also a construct about how we think women should act or how we think men should act. So the acting and the dancing being separate conversations and trying to tie those all together. And then the practical elements of not having a lot of men. Usually von Rothbart is a man in most productions, but we cast it as a woman because we had a woman who was very powerful and just a gorgeous movement quality that we thought embodied this idea of strength without being cold and without being evil, which is often seen as an evil character, but we didn't necessarily want to like play with that binary either of good and evil. So we cast von Rothbart as a woman. We cast the Jester also as a woman. The Jester is usually the prince's confidant and sometimes has more of a meaty role, sometimes has more of a comedic role. But we saw this as an opportunity for one of the women in the department who has just a phenomenal, powerful quality to her movement and can do what would stereotypically be called men's technique, like jumps and things. But why can't a woman's body do those too?
Yeah. Ultimately, it's still ballet terminology, it's still ballet steps. And whether or not you're a man or a woman doesn't mean that you can't do one or the other. Understanding that who we had for Jester, we looked back and we realized that confidants weren't always just male to male. Sometimes it was female to male.
Yeah.
And a Jester was not necessarily a comedy.
In the courts,
in the court. They were a confidant or
and oftentimes they were highly educated and they were actually offering financial advice or, all sorts of advice to the royal family or the noble family that they served. Yeah. And so gender was less important at that point. And so that historically there was precedent for casting a woman as the Jester. Yeah. And then the last little tweak we made was to actually put a man in the Swan Corps. And mostly because that was the place that this particular dancer fit the best. His movement quality and his height and the way he like his movement quality fit best in the Swan Corps, better than it did as a person at the court or better than it did as one of the divertissements in Act 3. There's all these divertissements from different nations and it suited him best. And that did bring up for us a couple of ideas about costuming and stuff and the human body. Women usually are wearing the tutus and men are usually wearing tunic and tights. Women are usually in pointe shoes, men are usually not. And when we cast him in the Swan Corps, there was is he going to wear pointe shoes and is he going to wear a tutu? And at this point in his career, he's not technically strong enough to do the full ballet on pointe. He has taken pointe class. He does dance on pointe, but it would have not been safe for him to do the whole ballet on pointe. So we decided to leave him in flat shoes and to put him in a tunic and tights. Because in the long run, we weren't trying to disguise the fact that it was a man in the corps. And as I don't know, there was a lot of like back and forth about, well, were we exploiting his body and putting him as a man body in the Swan Corps and not trying to mesh him with the other women. In the long run, it did become a conversation more about safety than anything for him. And that was where we landed with that.
Well, and that led us to the ending, because we do work with SafeNet and
the Jenny Lynn Watson Memorial Scholarship, which for those of you who don't know, Jenny Lynn Watson was a student in the department who was murdered by her boyfriend. SafeNet is an organization in Erie that helps victims of domestic violence, male or female. And so we partner with them as a fundraiser for the fall concert. So when you bring this back around to the end of the ballet.
Right, so the end of the ballet, so if there are the versions where Siegfried kills Rothbart. And obviously with Rothbart being a woman and Siegfried being a man, you go into this whole issue of a man killing a woman with Jenny Lynn. and SafeNet. But you also have the whole idea of suicide, which again, SafeNet is all about suicide prevention. And we cannot, in good conscience, do that, even though that is what typically is done for Swan Lake. So when we had a male in the Swan Corps dressed in a tunic and tights, we realized what we could do for the ending is that instead of death or any kind of killing, we can have Siegfried understand that he made a mistake, and instead of killing someone to get rid of it or dying, he owns up to it and decides to change places, which was perfectly acceptable to Rothbart. And so what that led to is that we can still have a male Siegfried transformed into what would be the tunic and tights and be part of the Swan Corps, and have that ending be, I made a mistake, I am owning up to it, and I'm going to serve penance for it. And in that instance, you are able to be a person. So Odette
becomes human, and Siegfried flies off with swans.
Yeah.
So it's not a happy ending for sure, but it was more acceptable to us.
Yeah. And it ties in, what we had at the end would tie in from the second act. What Siegfried does in the end when Odette flies away is what Odette would do at the end as Siegfried flies away. So
it gave a nice little motif.
Yeah.
Wow, that's also interesting. And it's cool to hear your thought process and why you came to all of these different decisions, especially that last little bit you spoke about with SafeNet and all of that. It makes a lot of sense. And I think you did a really wonderful job tying all of the moving pieces together to make it work. I'm curious, so you mentioned with the costuming for the Swan Corps, now for von Rothbart, I remember seeing a few photos and things on social media from some of the different dancers. So was that individual, they were on point, weren't they? And they did wear like a tutu, and is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We thought, I mean, a lot of times von Rothbart as a male figure is cast in and costumed in a unitard or tights and tunic and has a cape as a symbol of power. And some of the questions we got were why we didn't put the woman that we cast in a unitard and a cape to signify power. That comes back around to, why do we think that, a suit is more powerful than a dress? And yes, wearing a suit can make a woman feel very powerful. I love a good suit myself. I love wearing jeans. I love wearing, but I also love long dresses. And I think that when you talk about gender and costuming, again, the same reason we didn't put the male in the Swan Corps in a tutu was because we weren't trying to hide the fact that he was a man. And we weren't trying to hide the fact that Rothbart was a woman. And I think that, when you put these extra things on bodies to signify power, like a cape or a wand or whatever, it does take away from the fact that it is the human body that is telling these stories in the long run, and you don't always need the accoutrements. I love a good tiara. I love a good tutu. Don't get me wrong, but it's not necessary.
Well, and we're not the first ones to do this. So Eric Bruin back in the 60s had a female Rothbart in his version of Swan Lake. So it was nothing new that we were trying to do at all. We did have budget constraints. I'm sure that we would have, I know I would have loved to have had different costumes for second and third act for Rothbart, but that didn't happen. And but that's just because of budgets.
And I mean, if we were really talking about whether we're talking about the human body capable of doing things, if you put everyone in the same thing, right, then we are talking about just that it's bodies that dance, not female bodies or male bodies. And so that is a thing. And a lot of companies have done stuff like that, where they ungender the costuming. And so some of the questions we got too about the Jester costume is, why didn't we ungender that costume? She had a short short skirt tutu, but she also wore like a Robin Hood hat or a beret. And she wore flat shoes and point shoes, depending on which act it was. So ungendering stuff also had to do with budget. How much could we purchase and build, and the time constraints that we had with it. And also looking at the audience that we have here, like if we threw too many things at once, like talking about SafeNet and domestic violence and gender roles and undid the classical ballet element of Swan Lake, like would we have thrown people into a giant tizzy? Like, oh my God, this is not ballet. What is this? And so, picking and choosing where could we make the impact and make the statements without like turning the audience off. So
it makes complete sense. Yeah. Especially because there's this idea of what ballet is for many people. And so when you say you're going to the ballet and you walk into the theater, you have this kind of idea of what you're getting yourself into, for sure.
And sometimes it's good to push that, but sometimes you need to like baby steps.
Right.
Well, yeah. And for the Jester, going back to that, I mean, during the first act, the Jester was wearing flat shoes. And we consider that part of the costume as a casual costume, because they were out in the garden and everything. And that's what you would just wear. Well, in the third act, when it's more of a formal ball, that's where the point shoes came out, where it's more of a fashion statement, or, this is really showing some elegance, as it were, for that particular person. They would always do that instead of just wearing flat shoes the whole time or wearing point shoes the whole time. There was an understanding of where you would wear your flat shoes and where you'd wear your point shoes. So
now, did you both choreograph bits of this ballet, or was this just another version you were kind of just staging and setting? Because with some roles being in point shoes for part of the time and not for all of the ballet, I know that, some steps are conducive to point and some are not. So I'm curious where all this choreography was coming from, I guess.
Well, so I choreographed, we both choreographed bits and parts of different divertissements as well as roles. So with the Jester, I did most of that choreography, although Jennifer did some of the interluding choreography within the first act. The funny thing is, I don't view, some things are easier on point shoes and some things are harder on point shoes. But ultimately it comes down to the talent of the dancer, and the Jester was capable of doing both. So it wasn't a matter of working with point or off point kind of choreography. It was really working with the dancer themselves. Were they capable of doing this step? And yes, they were. So there were some roles or some steps that we would call masculine. Ultimately, I don't call it masculine at all. They're just a jump that anyone can learn. Obviously, the woman who did Jester did it just beautifully and fine. There was no, just because she was a woman didn't mean she did less than any man that I've ever seen. So very, very capable. Those are mainly what I did. Among the other things, we were really trying to make sure that the dancers that we had, even though we did some of the classical variations, we tried to hone it to their ability to make themselves look good. Not just, okay, here's the choreography and this is what you have and you either can or cannot do it. We viewed it as a way of, hey, we want to make them look good. Whether or not they're capable, it's not a big deal. We want them to look good.
I think the other part of this conversation is that we are an educational institution. And we are a classical ballet-based educational institution. So whatever that means and will continue to mean as the field evolves, right now, part of our job as educators is to give the students a foundation in where we came from, what is the history of classical ballet. So while we were able to make these tweaks about gender and all that, we did try to stick with as much of the traditional choreography as we could. the dancers here are all eminently capable of doing. So we did not have to change any of the third act pas de deux between Odile and Siegfried. We did not have to change any of the second act pas de deux with Odette and Siegfried. And then the way we put it together, some of it was from like body memory from the versions that we've done. And we've done a couple of different versions. And some of it I did have to do a little bit of research to see, how other companies were moving dancers around the stage, because we don't have the Bolshoi stage, nor do we have like a postage stamp stage. So, we had 18 swans on stage at once. And so how did we move those people within the space that we had? So I did a lot of pulling from this version and that version and this version for traffic patterns and things like that. And then some of it I had to fill in because obviously we didn't have either the numbers or the space to do what I wanted. So we had to reorganize a few things. But I think, so the responsibility we have as educators is just to make sure that the students know what our history is and has been, so that we can talk about why things need to be changed as we move forward.
Well, and some of the changes, though, I will say we did not do for Odette's second act pas. We had to change those, but not because of the dancer, but because of the guest artists and how short a time. So some of the things that we had to do were simply because
we just didn't have the amount of rehearsal time. Right,
in order to make sure the lifts were safe and cohesive. So we had to do some adjustment, and that's simply that's something that's unavoidable, not that the dancers could not do it. So
right.
Yeah, that's all just so interesting, as Kristen pointed out before. As she said, we saw a lot of things on social media, but we didn't know all this background. And I just really appreciate you talking about it thoroughly to us. And I think our audience will also be interested in hearing, your process and all of that. My next question for you is, have you both restaged this ballet yourselves before, or is this the first time you've done it? From like start to finish?
So I've restaged it a couple of times, but that was only the second act and some of the third act. I've done it so many times I can't imagine how many times I've done it. And same thing with
I toured this ballet for 4 years. So it's like living in me.
Yeah.
But all the same, this was the first time for me of putting it out there from start to finish. I helped Matthew when he did second act a couple of years ago. I'm mostly just like coaching, tweaking, but not actually putting the things out there. So I actually staged second act and fourth act this time. And that was hard. I have a lot of respect for what he did by himself a couple of years ago.
So yeah, but not the full length. This would be the first full length staging that we did. So.
And was that challenging at all?
Yes.
No.
I'm going yes.
I can imagine, but you also have so much experience from your past. So maybe it was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, and
it made perfect sense in my head how it was going to happen. Like I had a plan laid out. I was going to get this much done and this much done and this much done, and you run into problems, and you run into Hearst day happened, and so we lost a rehearsal day. So that was the day I was going to set this, and now I don't have them until next week. So things like that.
Yeah. The hardest part was the fact that we had 2 hours only, every day. 5 days. So we basically had 10 hours a week to stage a full length. Ultimately, it came down to if we compared it to a professional company, I think we had the exact same amount of time that they would have to stage the full, that they would usually allot to stage the full length.
Mm-hmm. And it was the challenges, of course, having been through the program, are the fact that the department has 2 studios and has, 2 hours a day of rehearsal time. And that's the way that university programs run, and the way ours is run. Being as a part of a liberal arts institution, there are lots of other things that the students have to do. So being cognizant of their time and their bodies, and being a full-length classical ballet is a lot of wear and tear on the bodies. And so being mindful that I didn't slam the swans for 5 days in a row, but trying to break it up, and making sure that people got individual coaching time, that they needed, so that they weren't like trying to work on the transitional things, which was the harder part when it came down to the whole overall thing was not the actual dancing, but it was making it a story that was cohesive and flowed. So, but you all know that from being there.
So awesome. I really wish I could have come in and seen the show. I kept seeing everything on social media and I wish so badly. It really did look like it was incredible, and I'm sure it was. So,
I mean, we owe a lot to Andrew for making the sets that we talked about come to life. Like, we started this conversation, gosh, last April, I think, talking about the vision and, you know, sharing, like we had whole Pinterest pages or whatever, storyboards, and like this look, and sort of taking it out of any specific time period and making it more universal, but giving it a feel of like Tolkien and the underworld, sort of that idea, so that there was this height and drama to the sets that he created, which was immensely helpful in making this work. And then, of course, we had live orchestra, which was a whole other challenge because a 4-act ballet for a civic orchestra, I think they had, oh my gosh, it was like nail biting.
Was it the same orchestra as we used for Giselle?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, different musicians, of course, because
right.
turnover and blah, 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 but a 4-act ballet is different than a 2-act ballet.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're trying to find the score, because we had pulled out a lot of sections that, I mean, if we used all of the music, it would have been 4 hours long. We didn't use all of the music, and, you know, finding putting them in the right order, because this one actually was in the 1st act, but now we put it in the 3rd act, which is where Tchaikovsky wrote the Odile Siegfried Pa is part of 1st act usually, but it's traditionally done by ballet companies in the 3rd act. So that was confusing for the orchestra. There were so many things, but in the long run, I mean, obviously having live music is one of the most amazing things for the students and for the audience and for the production as a whole.
Well, yeah, and it's a learning experience for the students, because again, if they go out into the field, more than likely they'll have an opportunity to work with a live orchestra. Whether or not it's something they work with every single time they perform, that's still up in the air. But being able to learn how to count and listen to the music, even while they're dancing, is an important tool to have as they move forward in a professional realm. So, and
Claudia too pulled together costumes, like again for 4 acts, without having a substantial budget. Mm-hmm. She's a miracle worker, and she, you know, we pulled things from here and there, and, you know, pull things apart and put them back together in different ways, and
it's made it happen
so much.
Yeah, there were a lot of donor costumes from other ballets in this. So.
Got to do what you got to do.
Yes.
Yeah. So it sounds like it was a whole team, you know, to make it all happen.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And of course, having Noelle there towards the end, after we had staged everything, like being able to step away and have someone else come in to rehearse for every now and then was really helpful for me to get perspective on things, and for the students to not hear my voice again. Hear it from someone else.
Yeah. And, you know, different opinions and different voices can help. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I think this is probably a good time to take a short break.
Here's a word from our sponsor.
Okay, so we are back with Jennifer and Matthew. The next question I have for you is how the pandemic influenced all of this. I know for Raw Edges and last year, all the students and the professors had to wear masks, and also you didn't have a live audience, but can you talk about how that changed or influenced your process this year with the choreography and the staging of Swan Lake?
Well, we were lucky at Mercyhurst with over 85% of the student and faculty employee population of Mercyhurst all being fully vaccinated. It opened up a lot of windows. Yes, we did have a few a few outbreaks, but because of that 85%, it didn't really go anywhere. And they were really proactive. We did have to still wear masks during rehearsal. Our guest artist was fully vaccinated as well and was tested beforehand. We did have testing before the shows, but ultimately it didn't change other than we couldn't have like 6 rows of the theater were in by the orchestra had to be empty. So we had 6 rows that could not be sold. And then it also, not knowing whether or not we could be in full capacity or half capacity, we did the 2 weekends, which actually turned out to be a benefit. Word of mouth got around Erie and more people came the second weekend, which was really good and interesting. Anything else?
Yeah, I think, the university has a mask mandate, on campus indoor spaces. So the students had been rehearsing in masks all semester long. And we had these conversations, over the summer and last year when we were thinking about booking this. We had to book the theater spaces ahead of time, like Matthew said. At the time, everything was half capacity. We ended up not having to limit capacity. And because this was a student show and not like, we have a presenting organization here called MIAC, and they bring in like Broadway artists and things. And oftentimes those artists will have like a clause in their rider that requires audiences to be fully vaccinated and show proof of vaccination, and everyone has to be masked. But because we were a student production, we didn't have those mandates in place, although audience did have to be masked. And the first 6 rows of the audience, like Matthew said, were empty. And that was mostly because the dancers were not masked. And so it was protective for the audience. So keeping 6 rows of distance so that it mitigated or dispersed anything that might have been coming out of their body's sweat and exhalations and all. That was the only really big thing. Everyone backstage and everyone in the pit still had to be masked, but just the dancers had to be masked up to the stage, and then they could take their masks off and then go on and dance. So
yeah, it was weird because they were also all the faces that they made underneath the masks during class and rehearsal and such. They had to realize that they couldn't do that
real fast because they were masked up until dress rehearsal. So they had to remember how to like act
right
and smile.
Yeah, I definitely feel like some bad habits have been developed with the masks in terms of what's going on underneath while we're all dancing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's weird too, because for some of them, I've never seen, like the sophomores, I've never seen without a mask on. And I was like taken aback. I had my own preconceived notions of what was behind that mask, and it wasn't the same. And I was like, wait, who are you? And so it was interesting. So
I had that experience recently since I'm new dancing with the company. Someone came up to me backstage because we also performed without masks, but we rehearsed with them. And she was like, "That's what you look like?" And I was like, "Yeah, it is."
Yeah. COVID has. Oh, sorry, Matthew, go ahead.
No, just the perfect example of unconscious bias right there is I'm assuming what that looks like underneath the mask, and it's not. So.
Well, it's been interesting to see how different schools and companies and organizations have been handling and going about this all, but it seems that you were able to successfully do so without, anything getting out of control. So that's really, really great. And I'm sure just wonderful too, to actually see everyone unmasked, especially for Swan Lake, and see everyone being able to fully like act and emote. So yeah.
And I'm sure for the students too, not having that opportunity last year, now having the opportunity this year in front of a live audience without masks, it makes the dancing all the more special and real, probably for them and for you guys, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was an amazing experience to see it all come together that way.
Yeah.
And it was very like big sigh of relief when when we were actually on stage performing and things were going. So
because it still was up in the air. We still didn't know.
Right.
I mean, something could have happened and it could have changed. So we were very fortunate to make it to the end. That's kind of when we were like, oh, okay, whew, it's done. They have that opportunity, and we made it through. So that was good.
Yeah, especially because right now with the new variant, it just, you just slid by that.
Right.
Now they're on break and everything's okay. But it's just so true. You never know what's going to happen. The pandemic keeps changing and evolving. And that's a really good point. Like, you're probably kind of anxious, like waiting to see if it's going to actually happen. And it did. So that's really wonderful.
Yeah. We're grateful.
Yeah, I mean, we were prepared for everything. I mean, Andrew was always prepared with what we did for Raw Edges last year, and the company ensemble for fall, where we videotaped live stream and all that stuff. So we were prepared for that, but we were very glad
didn't have to use that option.
Yeah.
Now, going back to what we were talking about earlier with some of the changes you guys decided to make, were the students overall very receptive to this all, or was there any kind of push from anyone or resistance? Obviously not, I don't mean singling out anyone, but just in general of the population.
And so it was interesting because some of the things, it wouldn't be, say, resistance. I think just in general, 4-act ballet is a huge amount of material for them to take on. So I think a lot of them were overwhelmed by the amount of work that they had to do, not just in rehearsal, but outside of rehearsal if they wanted to be successful. I think there were still a lot of questions as to why we did it a certain way, when they're still holding on to those same gender constructs of, women in point shoes and tutus and men in, flat shoes and a tunic. And if you're doing male steps, you should dress like a male. And if you're doing female steps, you should dress like a female. And I think that lends it to what we're here to do, is to educate that ultimately it's not whether or not you're a man or a woman in ballet, the steps are the same. You may have point shoes or you may not, but you can do both. They're all the same step. We tend to genderize them. I don't know why.
And I think, the students, no one overtly pushed back on anything. There were a lot of questions, even after the fact. I think was after it was all over and after they could I did it. Then they were like, but why didn't you do blah, 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 blah. Like I talked about the Rothbard costume, for example. Why wasn't Rothbard in a unitard and a cape? If it's a man role again, are we talking about the body? Are we talking about our ideas that women wear skirts and men wear pants? Are we talking about which things were we choosing to emphasize in the long run? And again, we decided not to take on everything at once, but just to pick and choose. So.
Well, and it comes down to that whole thing, where the assumption that women in a tutu and point shoes need to be delicate and ethereal. They can't be powerful.
But why not?
Well, and it goes back to the whole Rothbard. Rothbard to us was not an evil sorceress. She was
a protector,
a guardian. So it wasn't, the whole third act for Rothbard and Odile was not to try to trick Siegfried, but try to make sure Siegfried really loved Odette. And of course, Siegfried failed that test. He couldn't see through the magic because it wasn't true love, as it were. So we really tried to push those, that it's, that men's roles aren't just powerful only for men, but women can be powerful in the dress that they are normally trained to do with point shoes and a tutu.
And men can be sensitive and wear a tunic and tights, they don't have to be manly standing there.
I mean, I think the biggest questions we had were, some of the questions, some of the revelations we had from the students that did the role was, oh my goodness, I couldn't imagine how much women do in the corps. There's so much work, which is great. There's a learning opportunity there. And for some of the women doing the roles that are typically male, there was a lot of pantomime that normally women's roles are normally
dance,
choreographed out to the letter. And with a male, it's more of, you get to go around and pantomime and talk and observe around the whole stage. And so for them, that was a really big eye-opening experience. Wow, I didn't realize how much you kind of just improv as a male dancer, because it's not laid out.
Which is another really
I hadn't
interesting
thought
thing.
of that. Yeah.
It brought up some of the stuff, like when we were dancing, if there were like 3 couples doing Sugar Plum, all of the women had to do the same variation, but the guys could make their own variation up. And so, like, yes, guys on stage, when they have soloist roles or principal roles, are often, have the run of the stage, and they can interact as they, within reason. They have these interactions, but it's not prescribed. And women are often given the very strict classical pantomime, and you have to say these things and use these gestures at this time. If you think about like the Lilac Fairy.
So going forward, I shouldn't say if, when you guys set more ballets, do you think you'll approach them all through this kind of new, more like gender fluid lens of just playing with this representation?
I think it's important too. I think, again, coming back to the fact that our job here is to educate, and educate means asking questions and helping the students to ask these questions. I think it's important to not put people, like, send them out of here in little boxes and say, I'm a ballet dancer and I do these things, right? I am a dancer and I am a human body that dances, and I can do all of these things instead of just these things. And so I think it's important when the vehicle lends itself to making these conversations happen. I think it's important to do that. I think that not everything will right now, but I mean, you look at how fast the field itself is changing.
Well, that's the thing that, when she was coming out of grad school, the big thing was, is classical ballet dead? And I would say it's going to die if we do not make some adjustments on how we talk about movement and how we go about certain classical stories need to be adjusted. And there's still companies still doing La Bayadere, right?
Mm-hmm.
in blackface and stuff like that, and they won't change it. And that's where ballet is going to die if that's the case. It's that whole thing, and we ran across this as dancers. Jennifer was told she's not Giselle because she's too tall, but the Giselle that did dance with me was 1 inch shorter. So how is height have anything to do with whether or not this person can portray a young girl? Or
there are so many things that in our experience were prescribed. Your height dictated whether you're seen as young or old, and your hair color and your skin color and all of these things, right? And thankfully those conversations are happening now, right?
Yeah.
Especially the conversations around color, skin color, tights color, shoes color, all the things, right? And that's great. But there are so many other things that are problematic when you look at story ballets that we could probably do better. And you look at English National Ballet is doing a new version of Raymonda that shifts that idea that the Moor was evil and bad, right? And Dutch National is doing a different new version of Raymonda that sort of plays with that idea of like good and bad being tied to a person's race. You look at Peter Pan. Peter Pan has been played by a woman forever. So why can't women do things like that? And why can't men do things like, a swan? And you look at Pacific Northwest Ballet, they have a young man in their swan corps right now. And he went through their training program. He was, male body, does the male things, does all the men's class. He's like, I really want to dance on point. And he made a deal with them. He's like, they were like, okay, you can take the women's point classes, but you have to keep up with the men's curriculum too. And he did. And now he's in the swan corps in point shoes in a tutu, and he's beautiful. And there's nothing that says that he can't do that. So the fact that Pacific Northwest Ballet is doing that gives me a lot of hope that there are opportunities for us to keep pushing in these small ways, and hopefully those ripple outwards. But I think that, yes, our job as we move forwards is absolutely to keep asking questions and to ask the students to ask questions and to come up with, what's going to happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't know that about the Pacific Northwest Ballet and that dancer, but that's really interesting and important. And I think you're right. I think other companies might see that and be like, okay, we need to make changes as well.
Especially since it's such a big name company.
It is. And that's what's so cool about it. I also just wanted to say that, it's such an interesting topic to talk about because we have to keep the integrity of the tradition of ballet, but then also be able to be in 2021 and making these changes, because ballet will die if it's not changing. Kristen and I also interviewed Chloe Angel. She wrote Turning Point. I don't know if you...
I'm using that as my textbook for pedagogy class.
Okay, I was going to say it's such a good book.
Yep.
So good.
And I think universities need to implement it in their curriculum because it's exactly what we're talking about right now. And yeah, it's great. So
go Jennifer. Glad you're using it.
Yes, love it. So
yeah, she had some really great, just like real life, concrete, this is what is happening for real today. And it's like, this is not what's happened in the 60s or the 80s or the whatever. When you hear all those horror stories, it is still happening.
Right.
Then that is why you get out into the real world, and things aren't changing because we're not educating people to change or to see change as possible and to, ask questions, basically critical thinking skills, right?
Yeah.
All right, so our last question, or one of our last questions, what's the most memorable part of doing Swan Lake? If you had to choose just one thing, I know you probably have many things that were memorable or that resonated with you, but if you both had just one thing, could you tell us and why?
Well, I mean, a few things. I mean, just, I know this sounds really, really, really just very ballet teacher. But seeing a group of young students rehearsing together because they want to do it well, even though it's not a lead part, it was just simply, part of a divertisement, and seeing them just take it upon themselves to make sure that they're together to work that out. That was really, really, and they took what I have been telling them to heart, and they actually did it, and they looked marvelous. And the second is some of the growth that happened for some of the leads in how they humanized the role, like Jennifer and I would, and how it became part of them in their narrative, and how it developed as they went through the rehearsal process.
And through the performance process.
And through the,
from performance 1 to performance 6, they continued growing. And that was a beautiful thing. Slightly different, but you kind of stole what I was going to say. I think one of the most incredible couple moments that I saw on stage were when, and this is going to sound horrible to begin with, when a couple of the dancers messed up big time, like in their eyes, big time, fell out of something or didn't do the thing that they thought they were going to do, or the music was too slow and they were struggling or whatever. But to see them mess up or do badly in their eyes and continue through and continue stronger and to not let it drop was such huge growth. And like for that to happen, you know, at this point in the story, and for the story to continue to grow, to not let it stop their narrative, and to continue to like spin out that story, building on a failure and moving forwards was amazing. And it happened, you know, for some of the principals, and it happened for some of the soloists, and it happened for some of the core. Like, but for them to be able to pick up and keep going, and to let go of those ideas about perfection and the balance being the only thing they were going for, and to let it be about the story instead, was so beautiful.
Yeah. That it's not just the one balance in arabesque, but it's the whole variation that's important, and to kind of let go of that ego of showing off and showing the whole thing was really nice. So
if you were to start from scratch again and do this process all over again, is there anything in particular that you both have learned that you would maybe approach a little differently, or kind of change about just, I guess, how you went about this whole experience?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to like, well, I would have structured my time differently if I had known all these things. And but time and the way it's structured in rehearsal has as much to do with everyone in the room, and people being injured and understudies coming in, or me not being as prepared as I could have been, or thinking that they weren't going to remember and I was going to need to spend time going over stuff, and they actually came in and remembered, and I could have gone forwards, but I didn't think I was going to be able to. So I mean, there's all those things that like I keep learning over and over again what it means to be prepared in a rehearsal, from a dancer's perspective and from a stager's perspective. They're different things in some ways. I would have started, I don't know, like there's things I would like to have changed, but I you know, without a bazillion dollar budget and, you know, a full-time someone to do my other work for me.
That's fair. I know it's kind of a loaded question.
There's so much that I've learned that, you know, it's so much of it is circumstantial, and so much of it is like, if I didn't learn that stuff, then the next thing I did wouldn't be good. So
that's totally fair.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't change anything that I did. I mean, other than the only thing that I'm always going to change is the fact that I'm going to see the person in front of me and see what I need to do every single time. That's always going to change, depending on how quickly they learn the material or what they need in order to get where they need to be for the show. I think the timing was where it needed to be for them to be right where it was. No one was bored, but I think some of them were bored because they're quick at learning. And again, there's a learning moment there for them, because that's going to happen in a company. How do you deal with, I already know the steps, I don't need to think of any, you know, I don't have to think of it anymore. And then of course they get on stage and now they have to think it. How you can better prepare yourself as a dancer when you learn quickly is finding those details, honing everything to the point where it's the sharpest edge and it's ready to allow you to have that brain space when you get onto the theater, which then brings in a whole nother thing with, you know, especially with a live orchestra. Now there's another thing taking up your brain space, the floor, the costume, the lights, all of those are taking up brain space. So I think for some of them, I would try to, especially the ones that picked it up quickly, is try to keep on pushing them to keep on honing it so that they had that brain space when they got onto the stage. So
yeah,
Great.
that makes just so much sense. And I think just the whole experience, it sounds like it was super rewarding just in general, like for both of you. All of this together combined probably is
And everyone involved.
Yeah, and everyone involved, and just it sounds unforgettable, especially just the time that we're in right now. It's just super special.
We hope so. I'm ready to do it again. 2 years from now, we'll take on something else. But yeah. It was a good, happy place to come back to in this sort of like little bubble of almost normal that we were able to like live in for that much time,
Right.
So
Very special.
Yeah,
Well, the Mercyhurst Dance Department is very lucky to have you both, and we're excited, even though we're far removed from it now, to just kind of watch from afar what's going on and keep up to date with everything. So thank you for being on today to share your experiences with us.
Well, by the same token, we're very grateful that you guys are out in the world doing the real work of taking what you've learned and moving it forwards and becoming part of these organizations that are doing the good things. So congratulations to both of you.
Yep.
And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just wanted to say really quick that I found it really special that we did get to meet both of you just before everything happened. We probably had a couple of months with both of you, and then we left. So, I like to think that everything happens for a reason, and now we were able to have you on our podcast because we did make that connection early on. So we appreciate it, and I can definitely see how both of you, and from your teaching and from everything that we learned in class, it has definitely resonated with me as now I am pursuing my professional career. So just thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Abundance. We appreciate your support. We hope to have PK'd your interest. Feel free to contact us at abundancepodcast5678@gmail.com and give us feedback on what you'd like to hear. That is abundance without parentheses. Go dance yourself silly. Bye for now.
A special thank you to Richard DiFiore for our lovely podcast tune and Matt Mellish for our cover art.